Okay, so welcome to the last day of this conference, and our speaker, who unfortunately is not here, Giacomo Novembre, will be giving a recorded talk, and then he will answer questions afterwards. So I first met Giacomo in 2015 at the Joint Action meeting in Budapest. He was a postdoc of Peter Keller's at the time, a very young, vibrant postdoc, doing work on joint action, like piano duetting. And then I had the occasion to meet him 4 years later, 2019. I was working in Rome as part of a sabbatical, and we met, and he announced to me that he just had gotten his first faculty position, his first job as a PI at the Italian Institute of Technology. And he was really beaming. I think his wife was pregnant at the same time, so I think a lot of good things were happening to him at the time. But he was talking about the work he was doing, the work that he wanted to do. He was really excited. I remember, I think I said this, I would have said this had I not said this, but he said, Giacomo, you work on joint action, you work on movement, synchrony, you should really work on dance. And I don't think the dance was actually on the radar for him at the time, but then he just recently published this amazing study of dance, so he's really taken the leap recently into dance in a current biology paper that was recently published. He's done work with brilliance and sophistication. So for me, it's very exciting to see a young colleague get his first job and do this amazing work that he's done. He's really up-and-coming talent in our field. His talk today is about the neuroscience of music, so I recently heard him give the talk about the dance study. I'm not sure exactly that it's in this talk, but if not, check out his recent current biology paper about looking at the different axes of movement in solo dancers. I also want to mention he's been very prolific. He's only about 40 years old, but he's published 51 papers already at a very young stage, so a very productive, prolific person. So I'm sad he's not here because he's a really, really nice guy. You guys would have really enjoyed meeting him. It's my 5-year cycle to see him, so I'm sad that he's not here in person, but it's kind of a loss for us that he's not here to interact with us. But I don't know if you're supposed to say welcome, Giacomo, when it's a video, but let's welcome Giacomo to NeuroMusic.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank Steven for his introduction. Unfortunately, I'm recording this talk, so I couldn't hear it, and I hope he said great things. I would like to thank L'Oreal and all organizers for inviting me. I was very proud of this invitation, and I'm really sorry not to be there in person, but I've been very sick over the past week, and this was simply not possible. I'm gonna try to do the best to deliver this talk remotely, and the title of my talk today is gonna be Challenges and Innovations in the Neuroscience of Music. My name is Giacomo Novembre, and I lead the Neuroscience of Perception and Action lab in Rome. The people you see on the slides are the excellent scientists that are part of my team. I'm going to talk about their work today. We are based in Rome, Italy. We've been running for about 3 years, and we are supported by the European Union. One of the key words of our lab is musicality, that is the capacity to perceive, appreciate, and produce music. We investigate the biological origins of musicality, its development, as well as the role it plays in social interaction. And clearly, as a neuroscience of perception and action lab, we are interested in both the sensory and the motor components of musicality. So on the one hand, the sensory components of musicality entail the sensory perception of music, so encoding music, breaking it down according to its elementary features. The motor component instead refers to something else, to our innate instinct to move to music, or to produce music, or to dance to music. And this is an interesting angle to look at musicality, because movement is something that can show something about our internal states, which would be otherwise hidden. And that's why, from a social perspective, looking at the motor components of musicality and movement it's very interesting because it can be seen as a way to tune in to other people, to interact with other people through movement, including by means of interpersonal synchronization of movement, another key topic of my laboratory. So a few months ago, I was invited to give a talk to this event occurring in these days, and I was very excited about the fact that the title, the key theme of the event this year will be the future of the neuroscience and music. So I was specifically asked to prepare a presentation either addressing the past or the future of the neuroscience and music. And what I came up with is something that basically could be summarized as envisioning the future of neuroscience and music, a call for more. What I mean by a call for more is that I'm going to discuss directions of this field that I hope will be developed more in the future. I will specifically talk about 6 of such directions, starting with behavior. I would like the neuroscience of music in the future to pay more attention to behavior and to be more behaviorally oriented. Of course, as neuroscientists, we are interested in what the brain is doing, but the brain is there to control behavior, and we cannot learn everything about behavior by looking at the brain alone. Behavior is very rich, it's complex, and it's multidimensional. It can offer a wonderful window into brain activity, and I think we need to explore it more, and we need to develop sophisticated methods to encode behavior and use it to understand the brain as well. As an example of a behavioral study shedding light on how the brain is organized, I would like to talk about a recent study conducted by Felix Bigon, who is there with you right now. Hi, Felix. Here, we wanted to understand how people come to build synchronous movement in the context of dyadic dance. Everyone knows that when people dance together, they synchronize their movements. Turns out no one knows very well how they do it. There are multiple accounts. One of such accounts simply propose that it's the music itself that drives the synchronization. If we are turning our movements to a periodic pattern present in the music itself, we would synchronize our movements with the movements of another. Right. But that might be not the entire picture. For example, if I see the movements produced by a partner I'm dancing to, that information too could be used to synchronize interpersonally. And therefore, there might be 2 different drivers leading to the emergence of interpersonal synchrony in dyadic dance, the music and the partner. And how these 2 distinct drivers operate or interact is currently not known. So to understand this, Felix invited to the lab 70 lay persons, so people without dance experience, asked them to dance. So basically, he just asked them to look towards the partner, enjoy the music. Of course, if you play music like this music, turns out people dance. And what we did is we manipulated 2 factors: whether they could see each other, so whether they could use vision to adapt their movements to the movements of the partner, as well as whether they were listening to the same music. So people listened to the music through earplugs, and so they were kind of dancing in a sort of silent disco. They were not aware of what music the other participant was listening to, but they knew that that music could not be the same. Occasionally, when the music was not the same, the tempo would also not be the same. And this would drive to a very interesting situation where people are actually dancing to music at different tempi, but if they see each other, they would notice it. And then the interesting thing to find out is what the body would do. Would it follow your partner moving at a different tempo or the music? Now, first of all, how do you deal with movement kinematics? How do you analyze that? So people are occasionally scared about motion tracking studies because they yield a lot of data which is not always simple to analyze. You have these labels, these little dots that essentially tell you how a specific body part is moving in 3-dimensional space, but interpreting that on its own is not simple. What we used here is a dimensionality reduction technique, principal component analysis, to break down the complex and rich body kinematics into a discrete set of principal movements, which explained together over 95% of the all kinematic variance. So essentially, almost all of the movement exhibited by our participants. Now, this is a sample that shows you how the movement exhibited, the complex movement by one participant on the left, can be broken down into these beautiful, very simple principal movements, each of them tagging beautifully very well-known dance moves such as side sway, twist, head bob, and so on. Next, we calculated to what extent each of these principal movements synchronized interpersonally as a function of seeing or not the partner or listening or not to the same music. And we found out that some movements synchronized more through vision of the partner, and some other movements synchronized more through listening of the same music. Specifically, these movements that synchronize more through vision of the partner were side sway, twist with hands, side shuffle, while the movements that synchronize more through listening to the same music were vertical hands, front back sway, upper body rock, twist, and head bob. Now, the interesting thing of this result is that these two phenomena, like the movements that are synchronized through the music and the movements that are synchronized through vision of the partner, are completely independent. None of these results indicate an interaction. None of these movements are synchronizing interpersonally through both music and partner, except something I will show you later. But the point essentially is that the brain somehow is taking care of synchronizing with the music and with your partner at the same time by means of distinct set of movements. How is it possible? So how is the brain able to take care of synchronizing to two different streams at the same time? Well, it happens through a spatial organization. Essentially, what we were able to show is that those movements that are more synchronized with your partner and synchronized through vision of your partner are also movements that are organized on the mediolateral axis. So there are more movements that entail kind of left-right movements. And instead, those movements that synchronize more with music and through music entail anterior-posterior displacement of the body. Okay? Which makes total sense, because if you face your partner, you would move more laterally because this is more salient. Instead, if you synchronize to the music, you will be more anterior-posterior, and this is kind of more hidden from the view of your partner. In this way, you can kind of run these two processes at the same time and simultaneously. And now there are, as I said, no interactions between these two different drivers of synchrony, but there is one movement that kind of escaped this binary organization. And this movement is bounce. Bounce is somehow unique because bounce, synchronization of bounce, increased both when listening to the same music as well as when seeing the partner. Furthermore, we found that bounce increased in amplitude, so it was exaggerated when people were able to see their partner, and it was also the only movement that tightly synchronized to the musical beat. What you see in the graphs here is essentially synchrony as a function of the periodicity of the music, with 1 being the beat and 2, 4, and 8, 2, 4, and 8 times the beat, as a function of the different movements that we looked at. And bounce is the 10th one, principal movement 10, and you can see how tightly synchronized to the beat it is. And because of these results, together we hypothesized that bounce could be seen as a supramodal pace setter, a sort of very simple movement that we can use to establish synchronization with other people across different modalities. Now, I said a lot about behavior, but now we don't want to forget the brain. Ideally, we want to study the brain and behavior together holistically. And this is my second point. I would like the neuroscience of music to be more holistic and to acknowledge that because brain and behavior are interconnected, we can learn more about either when studying them at the same time. So an example of this is a study I conducted with Atish Kul. Atish was interested in understanding what stands at the origin of interpersonal neural synchrony. So earlier I was talking about synchrony of bodies moving together. Now I'm talking about synchrony of brain activities between people. Turns out that over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of research has shown how people sharing a social task synchronize their brain activities. But we don't know much about how it comes about. How does it happen? We don't know. And we were interested in taking a very minimalistic approach here. So we invited 46 adults to our lab, forming 23 dyads, and we asked them to simply look at each other while we recorded EEG, full body kinematics, and eye tracking from both simultaneously. We manipulated visual contact, so whether the participants could or not see each other, as well as body proximity, so how far they were from one another. First, looking at brain activity alone, so focusing on a measure of interneural synchrony, we demonstrated that even though participants were not sharing a structured social task, they were just looking at each other, yet synchrony between their brain activities emerged. It emerged spontaneously as far as they could look at each other. So there was a main effect of vision indicating that synchronization of envelopes of neural oscillations in the beta, gamma, and alpha bands occurred as long as the two participants had visual contact. They could see each other. Now, had we taken a fully neural-centric approach here, so had we recorded only neural activity, we would have not been able to understand what is the origin of this phenomenon. Because people are synchronizing their brains when they are able to see each other, but they're not even talking here. So there might be some behavioral cue that kind of pass through and allow the brain activity of one to synchronize with that of the other. A bit like I anticipated before when I said that behavior can be considered a sort of window into someone's mind because it reveals another wide hidden internal state. So essentially the question is, how do the brains synchronize? To answer this question, you have to look at behavior. And we did look at behavior by combining the information taken from the video recordings together with the information gained by the eye tracking. Now, the video recordings were submitted to a convolutional neural network that reconstructed the position of different body parts on the image over time. So they kind of gave us an estimation of kinematics of the body and of different parts of the face. And by putting these together with the eye tracking of another participant, for example, you would be able, for example, to reconstruct to what extent people are doing eye contact, or more precisely, to what extent one subject is looking at the face or nearby the eyes of the other participant, as you see on the top panel, where the blue dot represents gaze of one subject and the red dot is the center of the face of the participant. And the waveform that you see below is an index of how close the two are. So the higher the value, the more I'm looking at that given time point, I'm looking close to your face. And the second one instead is a general measure of body movement, so to what extent people are exhibiting spontaneous movements. And the third one is how much people are smiling. So it's the distance between the lip hands. The more distance, the more people are smiling. And when we paired these recordings across people, so looking at the relationship between those taken from one and the other, we observed a very interesting phenomenon. We observed that these social cues also synchronized spontaneously across participants within a dyad. So this means essentially that if I am looking at your face, it's most likely the case that you're also looking at mine. If I am spontaneously exhibiting body movement, it's most likely the case that you're doing the same at the same time. And if I'm smiling, it's likely that you're smiling back, right? So spontaneous behaviors also synchronize between dyads. And now, putting all together, having such an holistic approach and having now different measures of synchrony, some of them characterized by synchrony of brain activities in different neural bands and synchrony of social behavioral cues such as eye contact, body movement, and smiling, we now want to integrate these measures and understand the relationship between them. And to do that, we essentially estimated indices of synchrony over time, what we call instantaneous synchronization, and we calculated the cross-correlation between behavioral and neural synchrony to find out whether one was anticipating the other or vice versa. And the results of this preliminary analysis indicated that behavioral synchrony anticipated neural synchrony more than the other way around. And likewise, Lagrangian causality analysis, essentially testing the same question but with a different technique, also indicated that the synchronization of behaviors anticipated and Granger caused the synchronization of brain activity. Particularly, synchronization of body movements and smile anticipated the emergence of synchrony in the gamma band. So this is a study showing altogether how synchrony of brain activities can emerge spontaneously, and notably, it explains how it emerges. It emerges through interpersonal exchange of social cues. Now, I discussed about this field becoming more behavioral, more holistic, putting behavior and brain activities all together. The third point I want to discuss is computational. So if we want to integrate neural and behavioral measures properly, we also have to think about new computational methods to do it, because there are lots of challenges we have to face if we want to try to integrate all these different recordings types at the same time. Now, recall the slide I presented you earlier about the dance study. I hope you remember the gist of the study. Now, everything I asked you to add is that we are now also recording EEG from both the participants dancing. Now, dance plus EEG triggers already a sort of alarm artifacts. People are scared of muscular artifacts when they record electrophysiological signals, and rightly so. Muscular artifacts generate very strong signals, which are orders of magnitude larger than the signals that are elicited by the brain itself. And this makes it very difficult to isolate the signal that we are interested in, which is the one that is elicited by the brain itself. Now, it turns out that in the last few decades, I would say a couple of decades, but mostly the last one, there's been a rise of algorithms that are very good at separating these two sources, so the muscular artifacts and the neural signal, using entirely data-driven approaches. And one of such algorithms is called artifact subspace reconstruction. So this method, also based on principal component analysis, essentially does a very good separation between the artifact and the neural signal across lots of different movements. The simple ones are, of course, blinking or movement of your mouth, but it also applies to other movements such as the movement of your head, the movement of your hands, swinging, walking, and they say even jumping. Now, we didn't ask our participants to jump, but yes, they did perform most of the movements we saw earlier, and therefore this tool turns out to be extremely useful and efficient to do initial pre-processing of an otherwise very noisy dataset before we would address a new challenge. And the new challenge now is, how do you separate the separate contribution of distinct neural processes that are occurring at the same time? In traditional neuroscience, we would try to tease apart every process and examine it on its own. But in reality, in the real world, things happen at the same time. And for example, in dance, there is no one but many neural processes that happen at the same time. One of them is the perception of music. We dance to music. Another one is the control of movement. We need to move our body, to dance to music. A third one is the visual monitoring of our partner movement. We need to see what our partner is doing to synchronize. And of course, the interpersonal coordination of self and other generated movements, which we know is really a thing. From the previous study, we have seen how it's not just the music that drives the synchrony, but it's also the perception of our partner that leads to it. Now, the challenge now is how to decode these different neural processes when they occur simultaneously. To face this challenge, we use another method called temporal response function. So imagine the brain as a black box, and all you can do is to work out with the input, a certain stimulus feature, in this case music, and the output, the EEG. And what you want to do is to try to describe mathematically how the music turns into the EEG. Can we model this? Well, with TRF, you can actually model this using a linear filter, specifically a linear convolution, which turns changes in your input, in this case, let's say the envelope of the auditory stimulus, into the output, the time domain representation of the EEG. And when you do that, you find that the obtained temporal response functions, one per each electrode on the scalp, have a morphology that in fact is extremely evocative of the morphology of auditory response potentials, so event-related potentials, ERPs, with P50, N100, P200. So these are very well-known EEG components that are evoked by single sounds, except that now you are essentially extracting these neurophysiological signals under a very ecological condition, so where people are listening to a real stimulus, such as a stream of multiple sounds, such as music. So the development of this method has been a little bit of a revolution in the field of speech perception, and more recently is also entering into the music domain. But here we did something more. So here we turn it into a very much more multimodal and multivariate temporal response function. So not only we are using a representation of the music as a predictor of EEG activity, but we are also including other predictors at the same time. So since we are recording body movement and we have a very fine description of the kinematics, we are also including a representation of self-generated movements, as well as a representation of other generated movements, as well as an index of social coordination. So to what extent the movement of the self and the other were in phase or in antiphase over time. And to be as thorough as possible, we also include EMG recordings of muscular activity, so residual muscular activity, because the data had been pre-processed, taken from muscles nearby the eyes, the cheeks, or the neck. So all this information is entered at the same time in this very big multivariate temporal response functions, where each of the predictor variables generate a very specific temporal response function that will be used to predict the EEG in a multivariate regression. And this is essentially how this looks like. So the idea is that changes in a feature of the music or changes in the body movement of the self or the other of the synchrony are used to create a model of how the brain activity should look like based on the temporal response functions. And once you have developed this hypothetical shape or morphology of the modeled EEG, well, then you can essentially test how well this EEG is similar to the actual EEG you have recorded. And it turns out that if you do that, you can neatly separate the contribution of different neural processes to the EEG of the dancing participants. So for example, here you can see different scalp topographies that explain how changes in the music contributed to changes in EEG activity with a temporal response function that is highly reminiscent of the auditory response potential. so with the P50, N100, P200. And similarly, self-generated movements yielded a response that was very similar of the readiness response potential, another ERP that is very well known in neurophysiology. Similarly, other generated movements yielded a response that is including, for example, the N170, also a response that we know much about, studied in the context of action observation, and remarkably in this case only observed, of course, when people can see their partner, right? So because it would be very strange to observe it when the partner is not visible. This approach also allowed us to discover a new process, a process that selectively tracks social synchrony, so something that comes on top of the monitoring of self-executed movement or other executed movements. And this is something that occurs especially when we see our partner and we are dancing to the same music, and its distribution, very occipital, suggests that this process is probably driven by the visual cortex. And all of this, of course, while taking into account residual muscular activity that could be elicited by our eyes, our face, or our neck. Now, recall the previous slide I showed about bounce being potentially unique. We now have another result that suggests how bounce is unique. We used the multivariate temporal response function approach to examine which movements were the best predictors of EEG activity. Both movements that were generated as well as movements that were observed in the partners. And in both cases, we see that bounce is actually the best predictor. So it's the one that explains most variance. Both the bounce that we produce as well as the bounce that we observe in another. So this means that this is a very salient signal when we observe it in another person, and it explains a lot of variance in our brain when we produce it as well. I find this result very remarkable, especially considering that bounce was not the principal movement explaining most kinematic variance. In fact, it's ranked 10th. It means that it's the 10th most important movement in terms of how much kinematic variance it explains. Yet, when it comes to explaining brain activity, it's actually a winner. It's really unique. Now we move to the fourth point, which instead relate to the neuroscience of music becoming more comparative. Until this point, I have talked only about humans. But of course, we can also study the brain of other species if we want to learn, for example, how the brain of humans is special, unique, or perhaps not. Perhaps some of the processes that we are studied are the result of phylogenetic evolution and therefore are shared with other species, which can be interesting and very informative as well. With Roberta Bianco, recently we conducted a series of studies testing whether the perception of music lies on some built-in predispositions. So do we come to process, recognize, and sometimes even anticipate music because we have a predisposition for it? Or instead, is this also a result of exposure and learning? To test this, we initially compared brain activity of rhesus monkeys, so macaques, and human adults to a number of monophonic melodies composed by Bach, which sounded like this. And of course we had also a shuffle control, where the pitch and the interrupts and the intervals of the melodies were shuffled so that the duration and the spectral content of the music is kept nearly unchanged. But of course the structure of the music is destroyed. And these shuffle controls instead sounded like this. So the macaques and the adult humans listened passively to these melodies while watching some relaxing images fading in and out on the screen, not to have them following asleep. And most recently, we have included a third group into this research, a group of newborns, 49 of them, also listening to the same material. This is a very nice group to kind of interpret the difference between the macaques and the sapiens, because human newborns are humans, of course, but they do not have much exposure at all, right? And so this way you can tease apart different explanations when you find differences between macaques and humans. One of them being that differences might be driven by species-specific predispositions, or the fact that humans are exposed to music since very early on in their life. Now, recall the previous slide I presented about temporal response functions. So now we're exploring the same methodology again, except that we are inputting different predictors. So we are going to try to predict EEG activity using different predictors. What are these predictors? So first of all, we have an acoustic description of the music, which we call the acoustic model. It comprises the acoustic onsets, so the timing in which the notes are played, and the spectral flux. So essentially this is a measure of how the spectral content of the music changes over time. But we also have a higher order representation of the music. Specifically, we are entering estimates of surprise in both the melodic and the rhythmic domain. So for each note, we have an estimate of how surprising that note is with respect to its pitch or its timing, considering the previous context. And this is something that we can do using the model developed by Marcus Pearce, which is a model that is trained on a large corpus of Western music. And this is the results that we obtain by comparing different models. Essentially, a simple model would be the acoustic model, A only model, and this is only based on the, as I said before, on the onsets and the spectral flux, while the other models are more sophisticated and they also incorporate information about the pitch, the timing, or both. And what we have plotted here on the y-axis is a delta in prediction accuracy, so essentially how much more you can explain by the sophisticated model as compared to the plain acoustic model. And what you can see is that while humans benefit from both pitch and timing, so essentially they encode both the melodic and rhythmic components of the music, and they generate expectations about it, because surprise kind of give us more information that is useful to predict how their brains respond to it. Instead, macaques don't behave in the same way, as their expectations or their encoding is driven mostly by the rhythm but not by the melody. So this means that us and macaques, we share a similar kind of built-in predisposition for encoding rhythm, and this is probably something that does not require exposure to music. However, the encoding of melodic patterns is something that we probably learn throughout our life. But a second possibility that is alternative to the explanation based only on exposure is that instead humans might be special somehow. They might benefit from some species-specific predisposition, and that's why we included the third group, the human newborns, recently, who yielded results that are more similar to the macaques compared to the human adults, suggesting that indeed exposure might be really, really fundamental. Now, the question that I think should be addressed next is what happens if you expose a monkey to music like humans are? Would they also generate a similar capacity to encode melody? We don't know this, but we are working on this, on conducting more research on this line as well. The next point I want to talk about is that I wish the neuroscience of music in the future to be more inclusive. And by inclusive, I mean that I would like to touch as many people as possible and not to only deal with perception, but also with action. Now, action and music are kind of the same thing because music originates from action. Without action, music could not be played at the very early stages. And therefore, music and actions probably share much more than what we can imagine. However, most research on music is focusing on its perception. Action is studied way less. And this is because action is studied mostly in elite populations, such as musicians. Instead, I would like to study action and musical production in people who cannot play music, but perhaps they have a predisposition for it, or in part, they have some kind of capacity to play music, some instinctual capacity. So I would like to broaden the range of participants that can take part to active music studies and include elderly, children, or even patients. How can we do that? A few years back, I developed this device, which is called e-music box. It's just a reinvention, basically, of the traditional music box. The music box is a mechanical instrument. Like by turning a little lever, you can control the tempo of music. And the one I have developed, it's simply an electromechanical version of it, which works together with a computer and therefore is more flexible. It can play more music and it can be adjusted to do more things. So people just have to hold a handle and spinning around, and depending on how fast they spin it around, the tempo of the music changes accordingly, while their production, their behavior is codified as an oscillator. And this is something that is simple to do. We have recently tried to see, for example, if children can play it, and they can. We are designing some research with patients. We have done studies with people having different cognitive skills, and in the future it could also be used to do comparative research, for example, across different cultures. Now, in one study we are currently running in my lab using the music box, we're using it to have laymen, so non-musically trained participants, synchronizing music together. And we are studying how the production of so-called ancillary movements facilitate the establishment of synchronized music. Ancillary movements, for those who don't know what they are body movements that are produced while making music, but they are movements that are not technically necessary to make music itself. So like if a piano player need to play music, he would move his fingers, but for example, if he's simultaneously moving the head like this, well then this would be an ancillary movement. It's expressive, but it's not necessary to make music. And the question here is, would this kind of movements help people synchronizing better one another if they can see each other? And to address this, Sarah invited a number of participants with and without musical training to our lab to play the music box in dyads and synchronize famous dance songs. This is an example of one trial that we collected during the piloting stage of this study. So you have two people who are not musicians, and in this case they're not able to see each other. Each of them is playing a different part of the music you will listen to. One is playing the melodic part and the other one is playing the rhythmic part. And so the time series that you saw below represented their performance over time of the two participants. And of course, by putting them together, you can use a number of different metrics that can estimate how synchronized they are. And so when we quantified this synchrony between the two, musical synchrony, and compared it across musicians and vision conditions, we made two observations. The first one is that, of course, musicians are way better able to synchronize in this context, even though both musicians and non-musicians are not familiar with this device. Musicians have a transfer effect because they have played other instruments in their life, and so, they are already better from the start. Maybe this is not very surprising. What is surprising, though, is that we did find vision to help them synchronizing better. So when people could see the partner in front of them, they were also able at synchronizing the music box output better. But that is something that we observed only in non-musicians. Perhaps because only non-musicians use visual information to synchronize, or more likely because the task was fairly simple and the actual musicians did not require this additional modality to synchronize with the other. It was sufficient to listen to them. But since we also recorded body kinematics using the Vicon system, 3D body kinematics, what we also did is we broke down the full kinematics into different principal movements and distinguished instrumental movements, or movements that are technically necessary to play the music box, from ancillary movements, so movements that carry more expressive value, in this case body sway and head bob. And what we're doing now is we're trying to figure out to what extent and how these movements contribute to the enhancement of synchronization that is driven by vision of the partner. Something more we are doing with this device is to study how infants interact with their caregivers through music. So Chin Yuen in my lab has conducted a number of experiments with infants in their first year of life, listening to music and examining their spontaneous body behavior. We have learned a lot about when they learn to, for example, move in response to music as opposed to shuffled musical stimuli, something that happens around 12 months old, and also the relationship between the tempo of the music and their movements. And we are preparing currently a manuscript about this topic. But more pertinent to what I was just discussing, we are now extending this research to a new direction. Recently we collected data from almost 100 different dyads composed of mothers with their infants, and now it's actually the mother that is playing the music to the infant using the music box. So the mother is able to control the tempo, playing this children's song, and we are recording EEG and behavior from both simultaneously. And since this is a sort of weekly bidirectional loop, it's possible now that the brain activity or the behavior of the child might contribute to the performance of the mom, or at least affect it at some level. And this is what we would like to try to demonstrate, to have a sort of evidence of such early rising attempt to be participatory in the musical experience. In this case, the music is played by the mom, but the infant throughout body movement, which, as I said, can reveal information about your internal states. In this way, it can create a link with the mother and kind of impact upon how the music is played for him or for her. And as a third line, with Alon, we are also developing a game to permit people with autism spectrum disorder to play the music box with a caregiver or a therapist. In this case, we included a visual interface. So participants move the box, spin it around, and they also have this information plotted with the two arrows that you see inside the circle in the video on the right. And as long as they move at the same pace, the music sounds in sync. And the idea here is to let people play this game over a very, very long time period, so for several months, and to measure social social behavior using both explicit measures, so questionnaires, as well as implicit measures before and afterwards. And what we would like to demonstrate is that if people experience, people with autism experience social interaction for a sufficiently long time, through music notably, they might learn something more about interpersonal behavior or about interpersonal adaptation that might also generalize to other contexts that are not necessarily musical. So this is the idea that music could be a sort of platform where people can experience social interaction and then potentially have benefits that have relevance to other non-necessarily musical domains. And now this turns to the very final point of my talk, which deals with the ecological validity of what we do. So I really wish that the neuroscience of music could become more and more ecological. And this essentially deals a lot not only with how we design our experiments, but also on where we collect our data. And as an example of this direction, I want to talk about the Walkman project. Now, the Walkman is a term that was used to define one of the first devices that were developed to allow people to listen to the music wherever they wanted to. So a portable music player. It was very popular when I was a kid. I had one and I really loved it. It's a sort of grandfather of the current iPods. And it was a bit of a revolution, I guess, because people suddenly moved from a state where music was something that they would only listen at home. Then they moved to something like, oh, music is something that can come with you. You can listen to it when you walk around. And so that's where the term Walkman come from. And now the Walkman project essentially entails developing an app, which we have already developed, that synchronize Spotify with a pair of eye tracking devices that we have require no calibration, so people just put them in and these devices are able to measure where people look at. They also have an accelerometer, so they can tell you also something about how people move. And then we provide all this equipment, so headphones, the eye tracking, and a phone to people, and we walk them just outside our laboratory and tell them to have a walk around the block and come back while they listen to 2 or 3 songs that they like. And we also have a couple of control conditions, of course, so we're not just letting them play the music, listen to the music. But let me tell you more. Recently, there's been also an amazing development of algorithms that are able to classify information on images. So, for example, this is an image taken in New York, and what you can see is that the algorithm is able to classify whether the objects on it are cars or people, buses, and so on. And this is all done automatically after training of the algorithm, of course. And so here the idea is that if you put all of this together, you can get to what I will show you now. So that the subject choose a song he or she likes. This is the song that the subject is listening to. And then start the walk. So this is just the street in front of our institute. And we can see where the subject is looking at. It's the blue dot on the image. And the algorithm is also helping us classifying information in the visual image. So what is what? Is it a car? Is it a person? Is it a tree? And simultaneously, we have information about the gaze, but also information about the acceleration of the head. So bounce-like movement, up and down, as well as left, right, and from back, which are very reminiscent of some of the studies I talked to you before, right? And then we also have a little bit of physiological data, specifically the pupil diameter, which of course in this case would be highly confounded with changes in natural light. But why not? It might also reveal a little bit something about cognition. So now this is of course very exploratory and not conclusive at all as it stands, but we're running our first study in a few weeks probably, and I don't think we are far from thinking that in a few years from now people will also pair it with neural recordings at the same time. And I think this can be a very interesting direction to explore the behavior of people with experimental designs, of course, and to have simultaneous measurements of behavior, physiology, and neural activity. So, and with this, I conclude. I thank you very much for your attention, but above all, I thank my lab, the people on the first. On the upper row of this slide. These are really amazing people, and I'm very proud of working with them. And the people that you see below instead are a number of collaborators that contributed to the projects that I presented to you. So it's been really sad for me not to be part of this big event. I did really my best to deliver this presentation as accurately as I could. And I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for questions, and we have some runners with microphones. So if you could just... So I think Giacomo is going to join us now to answer questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, there he is. Hello, Giacomo. Yeah. That was fantastic. That was really very impressive.
Thank you very much.
Do you have questions? Raise your hand. I think people are just in awe of what you've done. Okay, so I will start the questions. So for your dance study, I think you know I've written about this kind of stuff before. So for you, the visual input was you called interpersonal was the visual, but the music was external. But as you know, there's also body percussion, and so sound can be also interpersonal. So have you thought about maybe taking the study to the next level, including some body percussion, maybe some body contact as well as other cues for synchronization?
Yes, we have discussed it with Felix. Also, following up on some of your work and some of your talks you have given over the last year. We are aware that you are exploring 3 different modalities at the same time, and it's true that touch, haptic contact certainly is important and it plays a role. Right now in the lab we are doing some experiments more on the line of the minimalistic interactions where people just look at each other and we look at their brain activities, and we have some new studies now where people hold their hands and we see that actually leads to special types of synchronizations, different ones from the one that vision alone would induce. But we haven't yet extended this in the line of dance studies, even though we really should, because certainly it is a thing when you dance with some other person, especially if it's only one person, that touch plays a role. And the same, of course, applies to the role of the body becoming a sort of instrument and creating sounds or becoming a sort of an additional instrument that can also have an impact on the coordination. This one is something that so far I haven't considered, but I think it should. It's just that I don't know how to do it yet.
Okay, we can talk about that, you and I.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, maybe Laurel will start out and. Yeah, so.
On? Yes, I think it is.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I was thinking that, combining some of those areas that you think are important going forward. In the studies, that amazing study of dance that you did that, separates all the different kinds of movements and how they relate to different factors, it would be amazing to take that cross-culturally. So you really just looked at one genre of Western music, and it's very possible that at least if not qualitatively, quantitatively, how those different factors combine might really depend on the music itself, but also the function of the music. So whether it's, something in a religious ceremony or a party or singing to a baby. So have you thought about that, and how do you think you could take it to this sort of cross-cultural level?
Yeah, thanks for the very relevant question. So I think that this organization we have disclosed with Felix is something that probably depends on two factors. Some of these factors are contextual. So, for example, the fact that I face you, and so moving horizontally would have more salience with respect to your point of view. But I also think that there are some, I call them rigid roles or rigid associations between movement and music. For example, the association we find between head bob and music, I doubt this is something that depends on the fact that people are facing each other. I think that this one is something that would show up regardless. And now, specifically, this kind of rigid associations, or to say, so those that don't depend necessarily on your perspective, on your partner, are also associations that might be influenced by other factors. And of course, culture or the type of music you're listening to is a thing that we could consider exploring in the future. I agree. Now, in Rome, I don't have access to different cultures. At least right now, I don't have a collaboration with anyone who would allow me to do such a study. But if someone was, we would be certainly interested in collaborating. And then, like when it comes instead to associations between movement and music and interpersonal interactions that are not yet dense, but something a little bit more preliminary. For example, when caregivers hold their infants and move to music. Now, you, Laurel, know about this because we are doing this work together. But we have recently collected some data from mothers moving spontaneously to music while they hold their infants between 0 and 12 months. And we find some interesting specific associations between the type of music they're listening to and the way they move. So in that particular study, we looked at the lullabies versus play songs, as it was probably the most obvious thing to look at first. And there really are some movements, for example, the horizontal body movements that are more tied to holding a baby while listening to a play song, as opposed to other movements, such as, for example, bounce, which instead seems to be uniquely linked to play songs. And so, I mean, this I think is very exciting and interesting because it tells us that somehow the brain reads music in a way, and then it expresses it using movements. And these movements can, as I said many times over the presentation, can be a window into their minds because they can tell us something about their states. And now when you hold the baby, you can probably transfer these states, and you transfer them through movement. So I find this direction particularly interesting, and I would like to develop it further in the next years.
Okay, well.
Thank you for a very inspiring talk. I would ask you, in the situation where you have two dance partners facing each other and coordinating their motions, was it possible to find some of the dancers more dominant than the other? I mean, in chamber music and in other musical situations where you have eye contact, it's very interesting to know whether a part can be inductive and the other receptive, and or it's the same for both partners?
Yes, thank you for the question. So in this particular study, we didn't manipulate leadership, let's call it this way, explicitly, but we know from research on musical ensembles that even if you do not manipulate leadership, leadership emerges spontaneously. So some people within a group of musicians would display a more dominant, so to say, behavior with respect to the others. And this is something that sometimes depends on cultural conventions or the instrument they play, but sometimes no. Sometimes it really depends on other factors, such as their personality and so on. Now, in this particular experiment, the dance one, we actually didn't look into any asymmetric information transfer between the two dancers. We just extracted a measure of synchrony that is really equally contributed by the two. But this can be, of course, interesting, and I would expect that such asymmetries might emerge occasionally and maybe more in some dyads compared to other dyads. There's also research in a different domain, finger tapping studies, showing that there are actually multiple ways how leadership roles can organize. Sometimes you have a clear leader, but sometimes the leader exchange between the people over time, and so it's not really clear. It goes really based on a time by time. And there's also a rarer case where you have a leader, so people that don't adapt much to each other. So this is just to say that I'm interested in this direction, but I haven't really explored it specifically with respect to that study.
Adam, yeah, I saw your hand at the beginning, so we will take you.
Thank you for the great talk. I have a question about the music box device that you guys were using. One, are people able to get their hands on those to use for themselves? And if so, how much control do you have over things like the music that comes out and then like the spin rate that you would have for playing the music at tempo?
So the first version that we developed, it was 2015. I was working with Peter Keller in Sydney. That one was not entirely open, so to say, because it relied also on some equipment that you had to buy here and there. So it was not super straightforward to replicate it. But the one that we have developed now, the one that I showed on the slides, is actually meant to be fully open. So we are going to publish probably a paper where we provide even the information you need to 3D print the different parts. And so if you have access to, let's say, a 3D printer and maybe an Arduino, you have already most of what you need to build your own. So that's the plan. And with respect to what you can program, so the study that you have seen presented on the slide, in those ones we only program the music that they need to play. We break it into two parts when the task is dyadic. Normally one controls the melodic part and the other one the more rhythmic part. There are often like 4 instruments split into 2 and 2. And then of course you can pre-program the mapping of the tempo over the full rotation of the handle. So like in the studies that you have seen, one full bar corresponds to a full rotation. And there is a beat every 90 degrees, if I remember correctly. But you might double check with Sara Balde, who's there with you at the conference right now, and she knows this better than me. She developed the newest version. But this is not all, because you might have noticed we have discussed pitch occasionally during the talk. I'm not interested only in rhythm. I think pitch is also a very important channel to interact musically with other individuals. And that's the reason why, if you, I don't know, you might have noticed, but there's also a slider on the box. And this slider can allow you to change the pitch output. Not as if you were playing music, of course, because you don't really have the possibility to change the music, that's pre-programmed. But you might, for example, bandpass filter it, like give more energy to some bands and something like this. And this is not something we're doing now, but we have it built in the box so that we could do it in the future if we wanted to. I hope it answered the question.
You know, actually, We're out of time. Now, you said that Felix and Sarah are here. Who are Felix? Okay, so since you're not here, okay, there's Felix and Sarah. They can answer questions about these studies and devices. Well, actually, we just have 1 minute, so I'm not sure. Maybe time for, but quick. We can go over. Okay, Lucas, last one.
Is this one on? I have a few questions from the online audience.
Oh yeah, thanks.
Okay, yeah. I've already seen one actually. Someone asked me whether you could predict, use multivariate TRF with estimates of timing or pitch errors. I think was thinking maybe of diad. I actually think it's possible if you kind of build up a vectorial representation of timing or pitch accuracy over time. It could be, I mean, discrete or continuous. It doesn't matter. You could input it in the TRF and see whether that alone generate a specific TRF function that perhaps is reminiscent of ERP, such as error-related negativities and so on. Of course, there's a huge literature there as well. I think it could potentially work out. I've never tried it myself, so it should be. I think it's an interesting idea. It deserves to be tried.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that answers the question. There is one other one. Yeah? It's actually related to Laurel's question. It's from Peter. The idea that bounce is a feature of dance that is unified across social cues and auditory cues is fascinating. But I wonder about a possible limitation to the high groove dance music examples you played. Is there something like a bounce feature for dance styles like ballet, tango, etc.?
Well, this is not a good question for me because I'm not really an expert of dance. If I was you, I would ask Steven. I would say, Steven, do you think that there will be a bounce equivalent in ballet or tango? Because we discuss often the role it plays on walking, because when you walk, you do have a bounce-like behavior. In fact, if you break down walking kinematics, you often come up with 4 different principal movements, and one of them is really bounce. So it's quite an important movement that we experience a lot. But I don't know when it comes to other dance styles. So I would like to know it from Steven if he wants to say.
I don't want to be put on the spot with. No, that's a tough question as far as how. What's the question? How universal is bounce in dances?
Yeah. Is there something like a bounce feature for dance styles like ballet and tango?
I would just go back to what Giacomo said, that to the extent that you're walking or translating, bounce is intrinsic to what you're doing with most dance steps that involve translation across the space. So, I mean, it's almost impossible not to have, if you're moving, there's movement along the vertical axis. So, no, this is Giacomo's question and answer session, not mine. So I'm gonna, I'll think about this during the break, but that's a tough question. So.
Yeah.
2 more questions. Okay, Isabel Perez, please.
Hi, Giacomo. We had a primer with Felix a few days ago. We do regret your absence, but of course, this time I was so impressed by the program. I really think that you have the future in your hands. I mean, it's very impressive. Now I have a very general question. You study mostly women, don't you, in your research? I mean, in the social interactions kind of studies I've read, mostly women are studied when they are like dancing, the mothers, etc. And you are certainly aware of that study that retracted from nature about dancing and the mate selection. So I'd like to have your idea or your thoughts about how is it related to what you are studying in joint dancing, for example, with the sexual differences, for example.
Right. Okay. So the only study where we selectively record the data from women is the one I discussed earlier with in responding Laurel question, and that's a study on infant caregiver interaction with very young infants. So we just thought it was more appropriate to do it with their moms. And this is more a decision I made as a father than as a scientist. I thought it would have been simpler to let the study run smoothly with their mom in the lab. All other studies are mixed gender or sex. We do have the information and we normally report it in the articles. Now, because we recruit a lot also through social psychology channels, we do have the bias that most people around the world have, that you end up testing a little bit more than 55 to 60% female than male, but I don't think that's sufficient to drive the results I have presented. So I think they generalize quite well. Now, in social interaction studies, there is a thing for going for female-only experiments. For example, in hyperscanning research, in the very early days, they demonstrated that the synchrony between brains is stronger between women compared to men. And I have even seen some papers after that research on different topics, though, but motivating the decision of focusing on females because synchrony was stronger in that population, and because of that, they wanted to kind of maximize the power of synchrony in this group. And but I don't think it's a good practice because even if it's stronger in females compared to males, unless you have really a scientific reason, you shouldn't do it. And now, like, you asked me basically whether I think looking at in the future, like paying more attention to the difference between males and females could be important to learn something more about the function of dance itself. Yeah, I think so. But not like I don't come to this conclusion from research on dance or hyperscanning, but more like from some of the research I did with Peter Keller. I don't know if you've ever come across, but a few years ago, we collected some data from a boys' choir in Leipzig, the St. Thomas Kirche. So this is the actual choir that was established by Johann Sebastian Bach, and it's still running. It's a very rigorous choir with boys in their puberty singing in church mostly. And in a very exploratory experiment, which is really more Peter ideas and efforts than mine, but I'm involved. Anyway, so what we did is we manipulated the audience of these boys singing at church during rehearsals. So these are absolute stars, Isabel. These guys, you can buy their LPs. Like if you Google them, you'll see like they're really, really famous, and they're a very big thing in Germany. And what we did by manipulating the audiences means that we basically increased the number of young girls on the first and second row while they rehearsed. And we recorded their singing performance, and we found that when the females were present, these boys enhanced energy in the singer formant, which is a region of the voice spectrum that is very important to stand out. In fact, the opera singers, for example, use this energy range a lot to kind of be distinguished by the orchestra. And we discussed this study, which is, of course, conducted only on one choir, so we can't really conclude much, but as an interesting indication that, of course, music can also play a function that is very simple and intuitive, that is to create social bonds, but also in a kind of sexual oriented way. And this is not to say, of course, that music evolved specifically to this end, or that other accounts on the origins of music are less valid because of this. I think music probably has many functions at the same time, and why not? One of them can also be this one. And also, I find it fascinating that this effect in this study, the effect was particularly strong on those boys that had already reached puberty. And this is also telling to me because, like, again, I say this more as a person, not as a scientist, but I do recall the difference in how I experienced and used music myself before and after puberty, and there really was a difference there. I can tell it, and not only myself, but also my friends, like making music, for example, in public, or the way how music is used changes depending on what you need it to do for you. Do you understand what I want to say? Like, of course, I'm being very colloquial here because I'm touching a ground I'm not really an expert on. But now the point is that based on this kind of insights, I would expect that looking at the difference, at these differences that you were pointing out, would be probably informative.
We should end with sex, and so I think let's thank Giacomo again for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, Stephen.
Okay, now don't move, don't get up, because we have now the flash video poster session for today. Be about 15 minutes, so just stay where you are and